This is the Christian Heritage London podcast from London. This is a special edition of the Christian Heritage London podcast. We recently had the privilege of being invited to participate in the unbelievable podcast and radio show on Premier Christian Radio, talking about William Tyndale with Melvyn Bragg.
You're unbelievable.
Well, welcome along to the show today. I'm Justin Brierley and delighted to be joined on the line today by Melvyn Bragg and in studio by Ben Virgo. We're talking about William Tyndale on the show today and how his Bible changed the world, really. Melvyn Bragg is well known as a UK broadcaster whose TV and radio shows are watched and listened to by millions. Now, while not a professing Christian himself, Melvyn has long had a love of the Bible as a work of huge cultural and literary significance. And his new book, William Tyndale, A Very Brief History, tells the story of how almost 500 years ago, the reformer stirred up Britain with his revolutionary new translation of Scripture. A translation which Melvyn says has had just as much influence on English language and culture as someone like Shakespeare. Well, Ben Virgo is my other guest today of Christian Heritage London. Ben regularly leads walking tours of London that bring alive the Christian history of Britain. He also hosts the Christian Heritage London podcast. He's going to be engaging with Melvyn today on how Tyndale's faith led him to this single-minded pursuit of making the Scriptures available in people's own language, a calling, of course, that would eventually lead to Tyndale's own martyrdom in 1536. So, Melvyn and Ben, welcome along to the programme today. Great to have you with me.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
First of all, coming to you, Melvyn, you're obviously someone well known to many listeners for the Arts and Culture programme you produced for many years, the South Bank Show, and of course in our time on Radio 4 every week, a show not that dissimilar to Unbelievable in some ways. But tell us about your love of the Bible, because that's essentially been around your whole life, hasn't it?
Yes, I was in the lives of millions of people over the last 400 or 500 years. I was brought up as an Anglican, a strict Anglican. I joined the choir. I was pulled into the choir by my uncles when I was 6 and stayed and went to church 3 times on Sundays, choir practices through the week, and was part of church culture. And heard the Bible all those times, and every morning at school, the school assembly, there'll be extracts from the Bible. So in terms of its language, I knew it. I was a devoted Christian. You could almost call me, in the sense, a fundamentalist. I believed in the resurrection. I believed in the miracles, and so on. And in my callow teens, I began to question it with a certain rationality. And I still have great affection for what's good about it, and what's good about it is immense. The actual business of final belief, I hover and quaver over, but I call myself what do I call myself? A man I got Christianity branded into me somewhere.
Mm. Well, it'd be interesting to talk about that aspect of this story a little later on. But going to your own engagement with the Bible, obviously, for much of that engagement was the King James Version, which we obviously had that 400th anniversary not so long ago, celebrating 400 years. But in a way, Tyndale was the man behind much of what we read in our King James Version, wasn't he?
He was, absolutely. All these 50 or so scholars. I mean, Tyndale is responsible for over 90% of the New Testament, and for about 75% of the chapters in the Old Testament, the key chapters, it turns out, books, or we should call them, that he himself translated. And I knew nothing but the King James Bible, and the sonorities and amazing language of the King James Bible, with its household words, its words that we use and phrases that we still use every day of the week, is still in my ears, is still in my mind, is still in everything that I write, and the rhythms and so on. And in your introduction, you quite rightly said extremely influential. I would claim he was more influential than Shakespeare, frankly. I don't mean to be silly and competitive, but the Bible is a better selling worldwide than any of Shakespeare's plays are. And Shakespeare himself was influenced by Tyndale. That might sound odd in the dates, but the translations in this 15th, 16th century of the Bible were all based on Tyndale's translation, all ripped off from him, none credited to him, and Shakespeare would have heard Tyndale's words again and again at school and possibly at home and in the church, and his Bible, as Rouse, the great scholar Rouse, pointed out, is full of Tyndalisms.
We'll come to you for more of the detail on Tyndale's life in a moment, but just staying with the Bible and its cultural influence, do you feel that we're losing that now in schools and, our national heritage, if you like, that place that the Bible has had and obviously had in your life for many years?
I do. I wrote a book, as you mentioned, about the Bible at the 400th anniversary because I knew people were going to dismiss it. And I just traced the influence of it, which is phenomenal around the world, but not only in Bible studies and in churches, but in all sorts of culture, in philanthropy, in laws to alleviate the poor, in every way you could think of. It's been extraordinary. And it's now lost, and I'm outraged by it. I just think it's a complete disgrace. It's another of the disappointments that one has with this country. You wouldn't think of knocking down all the cathedrals because people don't go. But we have knocked down cathedrals of language that are unique in the world. That's what we've done. And they say it's difficult. It isn't difficult. Shakespeare's a bit difficult, and Shakespeare's ragingly popular in schools, in universities. It's just how you teach it, how you play it, how you distribute it. It's an executive decision made by some of these dumb executives, and some of them are in the Church of England, I'm afraid to say, and it's the wrong decision. And I think we should bring it back as a cultural force. They needn't believe if they don't want to believe, but as a cultural force, as something that holds this country together and did so for a lot of years and could still. And as a source of language and rhythm and culture itself, this is massively important, especially for young people. And it really is. I think it's a disgrace.
Well, we'll talk about maybe some of the possible solutions to that later on. Ben, welcome along to the programme as well.
Thank you, Justin.
It's great to have you on. Tell us a little bit about what you do with Christian Heritage London, because you're very often to be found pounding the streets of London, guiding pilgrims of one sort or another around some of the sites that you probably never knew were on our doorstep.
Yes, indeed. Well, internationally, when people want to talk about how the gospel has changed the world, they start talking about London. They start talking about Wilberforce and Whitfield and Wesley and Tyndale, Elizabeth Fry and Lord Shaftesbury and characters like this. This is a city where the gospel has done awesome things and Christianity has blessed a people. And Jesus Christ fascinatingly said, the kingdom of God comes like this. A woman took yeast and put it into the flour until the whole dough was leavened. And there have been leavenings in this city. And what we do is we take people on walks through this history. It just so happens that in the square mile, the city of London, you can walk through history relating to each of those men I've mentioned, as well as Spurgeon and Thomas Cranmer and many others. And as we go, we tell their stories. And it's a funny thing hearing Melvyn there talking of cathedrals and comparing them with the Bible. You might be interested to hear, Melvyn, that when we stand outside Guildhall on our walk, I have everyone look up at that old building, and I say, look at that building. That old building with stained glass and turrets and a great vaulted roof. That is not and has never been a church. There is nothing in the Bible that says stained glass. That's what I really want. I had a friend who was a minister of a church, and when he had a funeral in his church building, and when the undertakers carried in the coffin, they put it down, and then they turned to bow to the altar. And my friend didn't have an altar in his church, so they bowed to the overhead projector. And you get this extraordinary reverence for physical items wherein the language, the concepts, the centrality of this gospel is what has changed this nation much more than buildings.
So in a sense, your mission, I suppose, is to take the physical things that people often initiate their interest and to say, well, here's the spiritual reality that it was behind it or it was pointing to.
Yes, we love to, because sadly, and I think Melvyn would agree with this as well, there have been generations who have been inspired by Wilberforce and Wesley and Whitfield and Elizabeth Fry and many others. And these generations, people don't even remember them, don't even know of them. If you go down that street in the centre of the West End that was named after a man who they said, no one should ever forget this man, Lord Shaftesbury. Everyone just thinks of it as the theatre district.
Yeah.
And we love to tell the stories of these people in the locations where they made history and thus point them to the story that motivated them.
Well, we're going to be going into the story of one well-known character, of course, William Tyndale, on today's show. This is Unbelievable, the programme that brings Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. So very pleased to be joined on the line today by Melvyn Bragg. Ben Virgo is with me in studio as we talk about how William Tyndale's Bible changed the world. If you want to get in touch with today's show, do feel free to email your thoughts, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Get in touch via social media as well, @UnbelievableJB for the Twitter, Facebook.com/UnbelievableJB for the Facebook page, and all of those links, and links, of course, to Melvyn's book and Ben's Christian Heritage London available from the show today at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
Well, let's come to you again, Melvyn, just to get a little bit of a sense of who William Tyndale was and just why his project of translating scripture into English was so controversial at the time. I mean, holding an English translation Bible in our hands is very unremarkable today, but it certainly wasn't 500 years ago. So tell us about him.
Well, he was born in about 1494 to a wealthy enough family in the West Country. He went to Magdalen College School when he was 12, and by the time he was 18, he'd got an MA. He was an extraordinary scholar, and in the end ended up knowing 9 languages well, including Greek and Latin, of course, and Hebrew and French and Spanish and so on. A great linguist, one of the greatest translators there's ever been. The curious thing about him, and I can use the word curious, or the unique thing about him, is that we think we know, but we know that from an early age, from the time he was a boy, and he read about the Bible being inspirational to Alfred the Great, and the Bible being in English, or parts of it being in English at the time of Alfred the Great, he was determined to turn the Bible into English. He was very much a local boy in some ways. He used dialect stories from his part of the world in the West Country, and he loved the English language. He loved the Germanic roots of it. He studied all that, and he wanted the Bible to be in English, and he didn't see why it shouldn't be. It was in most other European countries at that time, the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, in the language of the country, again and again. Spain, Germany had several different copies and so on. We had resisted it. This country, in England, had resisted it. It was in the nature of a sacred book, must not be touched, like the Quran. Latin was the sacred language. God spoke in Latin, that sort of thing. And he was determined to attack this. And he started it quite early, and from then on he was in terrible trouble because if you quoted the scriptures in English, if you translate them into English, you were against the law. People were persecuted, they were burned, they were tortured. Wycliffe's Bible, which was in English, had been about a century before. That was taken around by brave young men to different parts of the country, brave young men mainly from Oxford University. If they were caught, they were tortured. Well, in a place like the Lollards Tower, they were tortured. The Lollards Tower, of course, is the Lambeth Palace of the present Archbishop of Canterbury, and of all Archbishops of Canterbury. You go and see it. It's a torture chamber. And he took it on. And what he did eventually, it's a long story, he couldn't get going in London, nobody would subsidize him or help him. He went to Germany. He continued his translation, he got it printed in Germany, he was subsidized by some of his family in the wool trade. The wool trade played a big part in protecting him across Europe. We were the great exponents of the wool trade. The English wool trade was the staple of our economic viability. And he got it translated. He was interrupted. Anyway, one way or another, he smuggled it into England, and it became an instant bestseller. And as soon as they realized that, they burnt it. They burnt the books. They tried to intercept them at ports. They set spies on him. Until the rest of his life, he went across when he was about 28 to Europe. He was never, ever to return to England. He was spied on by 3 different spy systems, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor system, and the system in Britain, the system set up by the Tudors. And he was moving around. I mean, he was talked of, and he was a frail man, a dedicated scholar, a fantastic scholar, pure, everybody said, pure-minded and so on. But he acted occasionally a bit like James Bond, and I don't be silly here. When he knew that they were coming to get him at One Printing Works, within half a day he cleared all his manuscripts, put them all together, he fled to the river, he got on a boat, and he escaped. And it was when you look at the geography, it was a very daring and bold thing to do, and almost impossible to see how he got away from them.
Yes.
And we can talk to him about the end of his life later if you want. But constantly he was translating, and constantly he was pining to be back in England, and constantly he was urging the English to translate the book into the language of the people. That's what he wanted. That's my last thing. Early in his life, that is when he was about 21, 22, when he was a tutor in the West Country, notorious for his controversial views, which were that the Bible should be in English, and he preached on College Green in Bristol and so on, and he was a marked man. At one dinner event, a bishop said, if I were to choose between the works of the Pope and the words of the popes and the words of God, I would have the words of the Pope. And it's well reported by two people there that Tyndale was incandescent, this young man Tyndale, and said, "Ere long, I will teach a ploughboy to know the Bible better than thee." And that is a tremendous remark, because by using the word ploughboy, he was talking about illiterate people. And that governed his translation. It is a translation to be read aloud, and it's been read aloud ever since. And also a ploughboy intimated Christ's apostle, somebody who worked the earth, a humble person. And he followed that. He followed that plus his love of learning for the rest of his life.
I'll get you to talk about the St. Paul's incident in a moment, Ben, because obviously that is part of some of the tours that you do. But what I think was most surprising to me in reading your book, Melvyn, was that people are probably unaware, as I was, just how low the level of understanding and literacy of Scripture was, not just among the lay people, but among the clergy as well. Do you want to describe the kind of environment into which William Tyndale was trying to translate these Scriptures?
Oh, it was utterly corrupt. I must mention Luther. Luther had come in 1517, of course, and was a great influence on Tyndale, as it was on many people who were against the corruptions of the church. The corruptions of the church were extraordinary. I don't have my book in front of me, but in one parish alone, let us say, and I'm near enough right, let us say of 50 priests, about 40 of them couldn't do the Lord's Prayer. They didn't know they didn't know the Ten Commandments. They never turned up. It was just a place to go and have a job, really, and get away with as much as you could. The ignorance and the misunderstanding and the mumbling and the not saying was vast. And educated people knew that, and they were in despair about it. But they didn't know what to do, because the church was probably the biggest employer in the country, one way and another, and it was corrupt. And it was ignorant, except for a few brilliant people at the top. And there it was. You couldn't move it. And the way that Tyndale moved it was by putting this bomb underneath its central, the thing that held it together, which was the sacred received Bible, translated in 381, the Latin Bible. And he put a bomb under that. But the ignorance is alarming.
I mean, you did a major project on the Reformation a couple of years ago, obviously, the 2017 500th anniversary, Ben. I suppose Tyndale is just one part of a much bigger picture in that sense of people putting the Scriptures back at the centre of Christian faith in what had, in many ways, become a very, if you like, corrupted tradition in many parts of Europe.
Absolutely. And Tyndale, being a brilliant linguist, he had access, he had read the Scriptures, and he had seen this gospel which Luther was trumpeting in Germany. He has this magnificent passage where he uses the Greek word euangelion, which it's wonderful the way it's put together. Eu is sort of well or good, and angel, we use the word angel. It means messenger, and this is the good message. And he says, euangelion, that we call the gospel, is a Greek word, and signifieth good, merry, glad, and joyful tidings, that taketh a man's heart, and maketh his heart glad, and maketh him sing, dance, and leap for joy. Now, Tyndale, the most fascinating literary figures, of course, have exulted in their Wordsworthian romanticism and so on. But Tyndale had understood a message. He had understood something that had happened. And it was that Luther had helped to crystallize in the minds of a generation, and of course, ever since, in the minds of many. Because at that time, of course, in 1517, you have, in London, you got a population of about 40,000 perhaps. If you have 3 children, you would expect to keep 2. There's no anaesthetic. You get your water from where you get rid of your waste. And life was gritty in London. And you'd go to church, not because you wanted to hear the preaching. The preaching was often done by someone who didn't believe it at all, as Mel was describing there, let alone understand it. And the Bibles were only available in Latin, apart from a few somewhat crabby Wycliffe copies hanging around. And it was into that world, of course, that Luther brought this awesome clarity, that the holy, just God does not just say, I cannot wait to hit you, but he comes and says, I've come to take the punishment for you. I've come to save. I've come to die, to take the punishment, to save sinners. And that was the message which thrilled Tyndale. And of course, he was very effective on a one-to-one level, evangelistically. If you remember, Melvyn, one of the patrons he worked with was converted, as were the children, I believe. In fact, I believe it is said that the jailer, where he was jailed in Belgium, was converted, as was his daughter.
It sounds like something from the Book of Acts and Paul, doesn't it?
Yes,
But
indeed.
yes,
Escaping in a basket. But yes, it was that extraordinary gospel at the heart of Luther's Reformation, which was picked up here. And as Melvyn wisely and I think helpfully puts in his book, that it began to dawn on Wolsey and the others that Tyndale was more dangerous than Luther, because he was one of their own. He was a British man who was saying the things that this terrifying German monk was saying, but he was saying it in English. And who knew what would happen there?
And that is a phrase that came to stick, the most dangerous man in all England, wasn't it, Melvyn? He really was considered dangerous. But help us to understand again why the simple act of translating the scriptures into English could be so inflammatory in that day and age.
Because language is dangerous. Language can be incendiary. Language starts revolutions and takes them through. And Tyndale's use of language was deliberate and brilliant. It's been touched on by Ben. But his translation, if I can talk for a minute, he just turned it on its head. He destroyed the church by the way he translated it. There were no bishops in his translation of the Bible. There was an elder, it was the word for priest. He put love in rather than charity. The Greek word ecclesia, which was supposed to be the church, he translated it as congregation. In other words, the buildings, the whole apparatus of the church of Israel was not important. It did not matter. What mattered was one man's relationship with God, as Ben has alluded to. One man's faith, by faith. And he said that in words. And he also embellished the English language in ways which infuriated people, because he gave people phrases to speak which they track back to the Bible. My brother's keeper, knock and it shall be open, a moment in time, seek and ye shall find, ask and it shall be given you, let there be light, the powers that be, the sign of the times, fifth Luca, on and on and on. These translations, often taken from sayings from his own part of the world, stuck in people's minds, and these words they could go around with, they could talk about them for the first time ever. And we have evidence of people staying behind in churches when it came out to read the Bible to each other. They knew what was being said. It was not screened from them. They were not deputed to be unworthy to receive the words of God. They knew the words of God. So they could, because it was in English, they could argue about things in the Bible. Was this person right? Was that person right? They could take it into themselves. And they took it into themselves at a time when there were so very few books. And this was the greatest book of that time. And for centuries afterwards, they took it into themselves and lived off it, and it nourished them. And that was his great achievement. And then the two empires, of course, took it around the world, the British Empire and then the American Empire.
Absolutely. And in that sense, as part of that wider Reformation movement, it could both be seen as the beginning, in a sense, of the Protestant Reformation, obviously, and all that brought with it, but also, in a sense, the destabilising of the power base of the Catholic Church at that point. And this put him into, obviously, not only was he not in the good books of the King of England at the time, the Pope as well, obviously, was not pleased with the kind of part he was playing in this Reformation. So he had enemies on both sides in that way, didn't he?
Yes, like Luther, but you have the Pope being shocked by what Luther said. Started Luther's words started a revolution in Germany soon after they were out, which 30,000 people were killed because of what he'd said, in his translation of the Bible. And when you get Tyndale in England, the books are taken. The whole consignment of 6,000 copies of the New Testament, which came across London, were confiscated and they were burnt over 2 or 3 days outside the old St. Paul's. That was really, Tyndale saw that as something on his side, because he knew that people could not bear the idea of their Bible being burnt, and he was right. That act of vandalism actually helped the Protestant cause in London, because it was only in certain areas that it was going on at the time, very much indeed. And then the book took off, and then it took off in other editions right through the century. And not the tragedy, because he wouldn't put his name to it. This was God's word, not his. But then you get the St. James Bible, all this business about 50 of the finest scholars, and they were fine scholars, and they did a few amendments, and there were a few amendments, and T.S. Eliot defends them very well. But there were only a few amendments, and actually some of them I don't think are as good as the original. But I argue that in my short book. But he did. It's really important to remember. I'm sure I don't have to tell you to, but I have to tell myself really that words change things. I mean, by words we define what we are. You look at the great revolutions of Mao. You look at the revolutions of Stalin. It's the words. It's what they say. Orwell got that in Animal Farm. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. And just those simple words, you think, well, they think things have changed. And Tyndale supplied the language, not only of speech about Christianity, but the language of argument, the language of being able to tackle somebody greater than yourself. And, of course, all the great philosophers that are in the Bible, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, and so on. These were at last understood by the population, by more of those 40,000 that Ben was talking about, rather than about, 400.
Brilliant stuff. We're going to go to a quick break and we'll be back. You've got a little more time with us, Melvyn, to talk about William Tyndale, his influence. And I want us to turn to, the wider issues that his story raises and where we are now in our culture when it comes to our understanding and our heritage and that sort of thing. But today on Unbelievable, we're asking, how did William Tyndale's Bible change the world? My guests are Melvyn Bragg and Ben Virgo, and we'll be back in a moment.
Christians, we face great challenges in our day. Fake news, skepticism, disbelief. Friends, join the revolution. Speak truth to a post-truth world.
Do you want to share your Christian faith with confidence? Do you want to speak truth in a post-truth world? If so, don't miss Unbelievable the Conference 2019 in partnership with ADF International and Biola Apologetics. Join me, Justin Briley, and over 10 world-class speakers, including JP Morland, Krish Kandaya, Christy Mayer, and Bruxy Cavey. Rediscover the reasons for the hope you have and find the confidence to share it boldly. Unbelievable the Conference 2019, Saturday the 20th of July in London. Book your early bird tickets now at premierchristianradio.com/speaking truth.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to this week's edition of the show. I'm Justin Briley. This is the programme that gets Christians and non-Christians talking to each other. Not just a radio show, it's also a podcast. It's also an app as well. If you haven't downloaded the app, well, what are you doing with your life? Go and get hold of it wherever you get your apps from, and you'll be updated with the latest shows, videos, articles, resources, and so on. In fact, we just added some new video debates over at the app. Those are some of the shows we recorded with Cosmic Skeptic, a well-known atheist YouTuber, alongside people like Frank Turek and Josh Parikh. So you'll be able to watch those on the app if you download the app. Also available from our YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to. The newsletter keeps you updated as well if you want to find out more about what goes on in the show and some of the links that I send you every fortnight. Then do subscribe to that. All of the links available from the show page at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. And my guests today on the show are Melvyn Bragg and Ben Virgo. We've been having a wonderful time talking about the history of William Tyndale, which is an action-packed one. If you read the very brief history of William Tyndale in Melvyn Bragg's new book, you'll find a tale of someone who was evidently a brilliant thinker, linguist, someone who wasn't afraid to take his own life in his hands, though, when it came to carrying out this mission to put the Bible in the English language into the hands of ordinary people. Ben Virgo of Christian Heritage London is also joining us to talk through this. Ben, your walking tours include St Paul's Cathedral, and in that last section, Melvyn mentioned the fact that there was this sort of large ceremonial burning of all these English language Bibles of Tyndale's, which in today's context seems bizarre. The church burning Bibles. That's the sort of thing that people who want to make a sacrilegious point do. But at the time, it was felt that this needed to be done, obviously.
Yes. The shock for Tyndale had been this. He had been telling people this gospel. He'd been telling people on a one-to-one basis. And all Christians know what happens next. When you put your faith in Christ, when you find he is enough for me and he has done the work that was needed. My sin has been dealt with by him. Well, immediately, all Christians know what happens then is the devil comes along and says, so you're saved by faith, are you? And the new Christian says, yes, just by faith. He says, so not your works. And the new Christian says, no, not my works, entirely Jesus' works. And then, of course, he says, so, well, you can do what you like now then, can't you? And the new Christian says, well, I can't just do what I like. And he says, well done. Let me give you some extra rules. Let me give you some extra bits. Let's add some things to Christ. Now, anyone who has read the New Testament knows adding things to Christ is something which makes Paul, the Apostle Paul, more angry than anything. He says, you foolish Galatians, how can you add things to Christ? That is where everything goes wrong. But without a Bible, you're in trouble. You're not going to guess Romans. You're not going to guess the Gospels. You need the Bible. And so Tyndale, as Melvyn was saying, this was nourishment. This had nourished his soul. And so when he escapes to Antwerp and to Hamburg and translates the New Testament and has it sent over, it must have been a sense of like a crescendo. He had reached the top of the mountain. It's out there. My life's work is done. And then they make it to Britain, are captured, are brought to Paul's Cross at St. Paul's Cathedral. And there, while the crowds cheered, they were burned. It's an extraordinary place to stand and say, this is where we burned the first New Testaments in English. Because that's what we do, isn't it?
And in some ways was a sort of dark omen, I suppose, of what his own fate would be. He was obviously strangled and burned himself as a martyr, along with many others who of those, that tradition. So in a sense, that was the way dissent was dealt with in those days, Melvyn, wasn't it? People got burned or books got burned, depending on what you disagree with.
Great.
Yes, in all ways, but I mentioned Wycliffe before. Wycliffe made the first full translation of the Bible into English in about 1381. He was sustained for a year or two because he had immense connections at court, and then he was given a show trial, and a few years later the book was banned. But it was in the hands of these young people, as I said before, who were absolutely amazed and stunned by the beauty of the language, not of the language, beauty of the fact that it was in English. And so for the next 100 years it was taken around the country. But these little lads were pursued, persecuted. You were not allowed to have the Bible in your possession. Wycliffe's Bible, you're not allowed to read it, be seen reading it. And when we come to Tyndale, his bravery was extraordinary, because not only were books burned in London, first you burn the books and then you burn the people.
Yes.
Because after they'd had that book burning, so graphically described there by Ben, what you have, anybody who owned a Tyndale translation, anybody who'd known William Tyndale, anybody who spoke of William Tyndale, London was full of spies. It was an extraordinary place under Henry VIII. These people were burned. Again and again, we had public burnings at Smithfield of people who just knew Tyndale, had read the Bible, swore by Tyndale, and so on and so forth. This went on until Henry VIII decided that we were a Protestant country and commanded that the Bible in English should be in every church, and the Bible in English was in every church, and the Bible in English was that which was massively translated by Tyndale, but to use a colloquialism, ripped off by people who had worked with him a little bit, or people who just thought it was the easiest way through. The Matthew Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Great Bible, on it went right up to the King James Bible. But this force of language, as we've been saying, transformed society. It's difficult to underestimate. And one of the things about Tyndale's translation is his wonderful gift for, as I said a few phrases before, his wonderful gift for rhythm. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit it. Da 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 da. A lot of our rhythms in our poetry are based on that, and so that's one of the strange, powerful things about it. But another is he drew on three great, because he did several translations of the New Testament, but three of the great cultural traditions in the world. He drew on the Hebrew. He taught himself Hebrew. One of the first people so he drew on the Hebrew translations of the Old Testament. He drew on the Greek, and the Bible, as we knew, was first translated into Greek before it was translated out. He drew on Latin, of course, but then he drew on English. He knew Old English. He loved the compatibility of Hebrew words and Old English words, Germanic English words. He drew on all those languages, so you get inside that text, all these languages. The one thing above all, he wrote short sentences. Yes. The idea of a short, brief sentence was initiated, and Shakespeare uses it all the time. The killer sentence is always the short sentence in Shakespeare. That was a mark of our strongest literature from then on, and he developed it. And again, we go back to the ploughboy. He wanted the ploughboy to understand it. He wanted illiterate people to be as cognizant of the Bible as the most literate people. And once they knew it, they would know it, as he said, better than the bishops, and challenge them. And then we have the whole Presbyterian movement, the nonconformist movement, and so on, and a great new breath of cultural diversity growing up from that.
And I believe that his dying prayer at the stake was something along the lines of, "Lord, open the eyes of the king." And in a sense, it could be argued that prayer was answered when Henry did obviously eventually make the English Bible available.
Yes, I've got no time for Henry. I think he was a vandal. But he did say, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." He always respected the king because the king was in the Bible. He didn't respect the Pope. There are no popes in the Bible, no bishop. But he did respect the king. And he thought the king was mistaken. He thought the king was misled. He thought the king was misinformed. But he respected the king. And he thought if God opened the King of England's eyes, all would be well. There was a powerful innocence about him. He truly thought that if he truly thought that once he translated the Bible in English language, and once English people had read it in their own language, all would be well. Why should there be any problem? They got the answer to what was the biggest fact of their life, which was God. They got the answer to where they might go next, which was heaven if they behaved well. They got the answer to all the problems in their life. Do not do this. It was all there. So everything was solved. He absolutely believed that. He was puzzled that it didn't just happen like that.
I'd be interested to get your take on this as someone who leads walking tours around London, Ben. And many of the sites, I'm sure, are places where people were killed for their faith, martyred, sites where books were burned and so on. And I can imagine the average skeptic looking at that, and we have many skeptics who come on this show, as you know, people who are far less, if you like, sympathetic towards Christian faith than Melvyn is, who would say, well, there's an example, for all the good the religion might do, it inevitably leads towards violence and repression and, the narrowing of thought and so on. And they would obviously, point to many examples in the modern day world of that as well. So what's your response to that when you look at the turmoil that these sort of things came out of, the fact that there were people on both sides doing terrible things to each other? Where do you go with that, I suppose, as a Christian who believes that somehow God was acting nevertheless through all of it?
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with the idea that religion causes strife, because interestingly, Jesus doesn't come to bring religion. The people who liked Jesus were as famously were the outcasts, the people, the tax collectors, the women, the sinful women. Jesus was friendly with. It was the people who were the religious, who thought they could manage without him, who he had the arguments with and the fights with. And so there's nothing new in this. You always find the people at the cutting edge of serving this gospel who bear the brunt. But also you find they are the people who people start to trust, because they are the ones who say, I don't love my life, even unto death. So if you look at Rodney Stark's great book, he's a sociologist, wasn't even a Christian, but he looked at how is it that these 12 men changed the world? And he starts digging into the history and looking at the sources and finding that when there was plague, it was the Christians who served and died serving. And you find it was the people in the grassroots. It's fascinating that, interestingly, the day after the New Testaments of Tyndale were burned in the 1536, I believe. 1526, they were burned on the 25th, 26th, 27th of October. It was on the 28th of October, 1787, 261 years later, that Wilberforce felt that God Almighty had placed before him two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Now here's a man, Wilberforce is a man who the world says this was a great, great man, but not because of the fortune he made, but because he set people free in the grassroots. And you always find the most vital expressions of Christianity are not these edifices, the great buildings. They are people serving the grassroots, people serving those who have nothing, and those are the people who win our attention and win our inspiration. They're the people you name your children after, because they say, I've seen something which is worth living and dying for. It helps people to trust them. And that's why we remember this man, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Melvyn, I'd be interested in exploring, sort of, in terms of your own personal appreciation. We've heard that, obviously, in so many ways on today's show, of the Bible and part it's played in culture and language, and Tyndale obviously at the forefront of that in what he did and developed. But obviously, Tyndale and those who did it were not doing it simply because they wanted to create great literature and cultural achievements and so on, but they genuinely believed in the message at the centre of this and the person, Jesus Christ, that they believed all of these scriptures pointed to. Where have you come down in your own personal engagement with that? Have you ever sort of found that an interesting or attractive kind of figure, Jesus Christ, at the centre of all of this?
Oh yes, Christ is an extremely attractive figure, without any question. Christ is the one of the most attractive and one of the most revolutionary and one of the most benignly revolutionary men who's ever lived, and we seem to know quite a bit about him. That's reasonably authoritative. Yes, there's no problem there. The problem is what surrounds him. The problem is the resurrection and the soul and the transference to heaven. Those are the problems people, including me, have. It doesn't take away from having a very powerful residual interest in and conviction about a lot of the things that Christianity stood for. And Ben's absolutely right in that again and again it's the Christians who are leading the idea of teaching, taking the Bible and taking teaching to the poor, observing the poor in the East End of London, for instance. The Christians are moved in the 19th century, Christians to build great museums and libraries, the rich so the poor can have it, looking after the poor, empowering the poor. It's a massive Christian notion, and it doesn't figure in many other religions. It's the poor shall meek shall inherit the earth. That is a very powerful thing. Also, the richness that Christianity brought because of its extraordinary flexibility. I mean, you have this religion, which is also the greatest patron of the arts that we've seen in Europe for centuries, maybe ever, in every sort of art. You mentioned stained glass, but there's stone, there's paintings, there's singing, on and on it goes. Philosophy, development philosophy, and so it goes. So you can't shift all that away. You can say, of course, that there's a bad side to it. There's the burning of people, of course. That's terrible. The Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, they're terrible. And on it goes. The abuse that we now see nowadays must have gone on. That's terrible. And the bad side is there, but the Christianity has always come, as Ben pointed out, has always come alongside. As soon as Christianity has been there, the devil has popped up in one form or another, called the devil or not called the devil, to attempt to rival it or destroy it, or to rule in a different place, like Lucifer, who was, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And the people wanted to rule in darkness, and they did.
And you've obviously met so many people of religious traditions over the years of your broadcasting career, Melvyn. Has any of those engagements with them sort of brought you any closer to kind of considering, I suppose, those big claims, the miracle claims? I know you're a man of science as much as you are of culture and religion and so on. Is that the sticking point for you, the miraculous nature of what ultimately is the heart of the Christian story?
Well, yes, it is the sticking point, but I don't think it's the heart of the Christian story, actually.
Interesting. Tell me why.
I don't think it is, no. I think the heart of the Christian story is, if you want a heart, the teachings of Jesus Christ. I don't think our heart of the Christian story is the resurrection. That's the heart of the Christian appeal in some areas. I don't think the heart of the Christian story is that a soul will go into heaven if you behave well enough here on earth. That's the heart of a lot of stories of different religions, the Jewish religion, for instance, and so on. So no, that isn't to me the heart of it. The heart of it is the emanation of goodness that came from a person like Christ and his followers, and has been pursued by so many people since.
Well, it'd be interesting in your response to that, Ben. Just in as much as for Melvyn, obviously, it's the message, it's the teachings, it's those things that have shaped our culture as well in so many ways. Why for you? I suppose I'm guessing the heart of it is actually there in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, even more than perhaps his teachings, as important as they have been.
Yes, indeed. Well, it's what makes Tyndale's heart sing for joy is this euangelion that we call gospel, the merry, glad, joyful tidings that taketh a man's heart glad and maketh him sing and dance and leap for joy. I don't sing and leap for joy when I'm told what to do necessarily. I get told. What makes me sing for joy is being told He loved me and gave Himself for me. He took the punishment. He did it, and it was sufficient. It worked. He rose, and that's at the heart of the message, which interestingly, all these characters, all these great heroes treasured. They gloried in the cross. They gloried in the resurrection of Jesus. And these things, if you look at what Jesus' teaching points to, he frequently will say extraordinary claims. We're trying to actually, it's funny you mention East London and the poor, Melvyn, actually planting a church presently in East London. And we're surrounded by Muslims. It's interesting, they're convinced that Jesus was a prophet. But strikingly, they don't like to read what he actually said, because everything he points to, he keeps saying, I'm God, I'm God, I'm God. He keeps saying, I am the Father, are one, and so on. And someone who was teaching that kind of thing and was a teacher would be quickly written off. But here's a man who makes these extraordinary claims, and then he says, and this is what I've come to do. I've come to save. I've come to seek and save the lost. So, yeah, my proposal would be, in the middle of it all, and you speak movingly in the foreword of your book of how reaching the last lap of life, considering the story of Jesus, the heart of it is this: is that it doesn't make sense without what he's done. It doesn't make sense without what he's done. And I accept, yes, the church has been bad. The church has been bad to me. But in the middle of it all, what encourages me is every morning I come to a Saviour who says, I loved you and gave myself for you. It's that's the heart of the thing that I encourage.
You're being evangelized here, Melvyn. just
listening attentively.
Well, I mean,
for a man who doesn't like sermons, he gives quite good sermons, your Ben, doesn't he?
Well, I mean, I suppose, this is where the rubber hits the road. In the end of the day, we're all on the same page when it comes to the incredibly important value of what Tyndale did, what the Bible has done, what Christian culture has done, if you like, for Europe and the West especially. But obviously there is a parting of ways in terms of, at the centre of it, is there something supernatural? I mean, I would assume you would say even that not just the inspiration of those scriptures in that sense is supernatural, Ben, but even Tyndale's own working of them into the English language, God was behind that in some way. That there is that all of this, if you like, has had God at work. It's not just a happy accident that these scriptures in English have formed the bedrock of English culture and literature.
As much as he's inspired any artist. I mean, as we know, Tyndale invents words that we now use on a daily basis. Tyndale invented the word beautiful. The word atonement, the word loving kindness. He was a great, and if you read David Daniel's great biography of him, David Daniel was Professor of English at University College London, a fine university, where he said that David Daniel, of course, is someone who knows language, and if you read his great biography of Tyndale, you see the man was brilliant with language. If you read how he translates Genesis chapter 3. The authorized version has the serpent saying to Eve, if you touch the tree, you shall surely not die, says the serpent. And but Tyndale says, no, if you touch the tree, tush, you shall not die. You get this serpent-like voice, which is the man was brilliant, but he was inspired in the way that any artist is inspired, because we believe in a God who is gracious, and he inspires Da Vinci alongside Bach, alongside Mozart, alongside Tyndale.
I'm not expecting to get you converted in today's programme, Melvyn, but it is significant to me that you are at least very much not on the same page as some of the loudest voices in our culture have been recently, the Richard Dawkins, the new atheists, who to some extent have very much downplayed or even poured scorn on the Christian heritage and biblical culture of the UK. I mean, and you would very much like to see that reversed, even though you're not doing it in a sense with a sort of Christian agenda as such.
Well, as a scientist, I respect Richard Dawkins. I'm not a scientist. He, as a scientist, is absolutely brilliant and a wonderful communicator. But the idea of the dismissiveness of the atheistic point of view was why I spent quite a while time in my life writing about the books about the Bible, about the impact of the Bible. Because I thought a lot of that would come out in the 400th anniversary, and I wanted to put my hat in the ring to sort of counter it. Without, from a strange point of view, I think if a Christian had written it, it would have had a much more impact. But I wrote it as I am, and it said what Christianity has done. And when you examine it again and again and again, the benefits have been enormous. And the bad side is also is something that one has to sort of worry about and take on board. But it's possible, I think, unlike Ben doesn't believe this at all. I think it's possible to take something and not everything.
And in that sense, I've met people who, while they don't hold the specific beliefs of Christianity, they would call themselves, culturally, they would say, I'm Christian, and I'm guessing you are no stranger to going into a church building and enjoying what you can enjoy from that, Melvyn.
Well, yes, I wouldn't call myself a Christian because I respect it too much.
Right.
I'm somebody who is fascinated by and branded by Christianity, and I love going into churches, particularly two sorts of churches: empty village churches, where people have been there, often in this country, for centuries, and you do feel, if you've any feelings at all, you feel that there is a mystery there which is beyond reason, that, like the heart has its reasons that reason doesn't know. You feel what's going on there has its reasons that reason doesn't know. And I love the evensong in the cathedrals, and I never miss a chance to go to it, to listen to the choir singing in those places. And again, the power of music, which is something that inhabits your mind in a way that even words don't do. It takes you somewhere that you can't describe, but you know it exists.
It's been wonderful having you both on the show today. Thank you very much for joining me. Ben, if people want more about Christian heritage, you've got a podcast, I believe, Christian Heritage London podcast. I assume you can find that wherever you get your podcasts from.
Indeed.
And where should people look if they want to book themselves into one of these fascinating walking tours?
If you look on the website, christianheritagelondon.org is the name of our website, and you'd be very welcome to come. We'd love to take people through these stories.
All the very best, Melvyn. I know you've been talking up William Tyndale for a few years now, and I hope that it goes well as you continue to take his message. In a way, this is, I guess, part of a bigger mission for you to just remind people of where they've been, what brought them to this place, and not forget the incredible heritage of people like Tyndale and others who gave us the culture and life that we take for granted these days.
Exactly, I agree.
Well,
that's what I'm trying to do at one small pebble on the beach.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we're so grateful for you. Many of us have listened to you so many times, and many Christians, I'm sure, are very grateful for the fairness that you've unusually showed in our generation, speaking respectfully and sympathetically of Christianity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melvyn. Thanks for being with us on the programme today.
Thank you very much.
That's my guest, Melvyn Bragg. Again, if you want to get hold of the book, it's published by SPCK, William Tyndale, A Very Brief History. Ben Virgo, thank you for being with me in studio today.
Thank you, Justin. For more episodes of the Christian Heritage London podcast, and for information on Christian Heritage London events, tours and walks, please go to christianheritagelondon.org.